Hello, adventurers! My name is Chan, so welcome to my spellbook, and thank you so much for tuning into the second episode of our Elven Subrace series. We're gonna start going into the Alladren now. Now, could I just do one big video on them? I guess, but that doesn't really make sense with how the channel's laid out. So, yours truly has to go through all of them separately, which is a theme I have no doubt you'll be noticing really quick here. What are Alladren? I hear you saying. Well, quite simply put, they're elves that never really left the Feywild. If you look at the history of elves, at least from a 5e standpoint, they started out as kind of like these shapeless, formless demigods, and then they were tricked into retaining form, and the Eladrin were kind of like, nah bro, we're gonna stay in the Feywild, and that's kind of how it played out, more or less. Check out Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes if you want the full story. There's also a ton of lore channels on YouTube that I can't really compare to, so check them out as well, but long story short, you're an elf native to the Feywild, and you represent a season, really. In this particular case, we're going over the Autumn Alladren, which is the season of peace and goodwill, when summer's harvest is shared with all. Yeah, they're kind of the good guys, I guess, if you want to look at them like that. None of them are inherently evil per se, but these guys are particularly good-natured, so spin that however it is you'd like. Before we dive into their mechanics here, let me just say, if you're just watching this video in isolation, it's not going to make a ton of sense because you still get your elf features in addition to all these, so just check out the full playlist. At the very least, check out the elf video so you're not half filling out your character sheet. Just in order to find the playlist, click on that little eye icon up top there and select it from the drop down menu, or wait until the end of the video and click on one of the end cards. That's your best way to do it. In any case, with all of that out of the way, let's now move on to its mechanics. So in terms of mechanics here, these two are universal for all of the Alladren, all four of them. They all get a +1 bonus to their charisma. They all get Fey Step, which is just a redressed Misty Step. And yeah, where they differ is the customization aspect of their Fey Step. But we'll get into that in a little bit here. But let's talk about these mechanics for a little bit. The +1 to charisma, always super helpful, always super great. Charisma is just one of those stats in role-playing games where it's almost always beneficial to have a high charisma. And in terms of Fey Step, it lets you use a bonus action to magically teleport 30 feet to an occupied space you can see. Once you use this trait, you can't use it again until you finish a short or long rest. There's no components for this, it's kind of an at-will thing. So that's really convenient for doing things like escaping shackles or manacles, for example, or just prison in general. In addition to that, it's a little bit better than Misty Step, where there isn't really a ton of tells to it. That being said, the customization that each different Alladren might change that a little bit. But overall, it's just a super strong ability, especially since it can reset on a short rest, and if your games are like most of mine, and you take several short rests per session, you're going to get a lot of use out of Fey Step, which is really great. Now let's move on to the autumn-specific variant of Fey Step. Before we get in too far, when you're calculating the DC for any of these Fey Step abilities, it's going to be about the same. So it's 8 plus your proficiency bonus plus your charisma modifier. So clearly some classes are going to benefit from this a little bit more than others, namely the classes that use charisma as their spellcasting ability modifier. However, once again, charisma is almost always a relatively high stat, almost regardless of what class you're playing. The only real exceptions exist when you have multiple different ability scores that outrank it. For example, Eldritch Knights Strength is probably going to be your main, unless you're playing a dex-based Eldritch Knight, which I've seen with decent effectiveness, but predominantly strength, followed up by intelligence, because that's your spellcasting modifier, and then whatever you're not spending in those two, you're likely spending in constitution. So in that particular class and subclass, you're likely not going to have a very high charisma, but as a rule of thumb, if you were coming from a class that has one or maybe two important ability scores, charisma is going to be a pretty strong choice for your third. Now that I've addressed that, let's go into Autumn's specific phase step. Immediately after you use your phase step, up to 2 creatures of your choice that you can see within 10 feet of you must succeed on a wisdom saving throw or be charmed by you for 1 minute or until your companions deal any damage to it. This is really, really strong. A lot of times, the biggest kind of call downs for the Alladren come in the shape of people who make the argument that their traits aren't good in every situation. They're usually pretty combat focused. The Autumn Alladren is kind of the opposite of that. The charmed condition is one of the best conditions in the game. It's not quite as good as paralysis, but outside of paralysis, it's arguably one of the best. It does a lot in terms of not only buying your party a ton of time during a combat, but also is likely to help you out greatly in social situations as well, which is super nice. And it's not really a spell, it's just a magical effect, so there's not a ton of ways to block it, even amongst well-established spellcasters, so that just puts a finer point on how useful it is. There is, of course, kind of a caveat to this, and that's its limited range. 10 feet, it's not that great. It is kind of a 10-foot radius, which is a little bit nicer, so 20 feet total from end to end. But there aren't going to be... I don't know. It's one of those weird abilities where it's kind of like Fireball, where typically as soon as parties start abusing it too much, you're going to see dungeon masters, consciously or not, kind of spacing enemies out a little bit more. So this might be combined with other spells and abilities to kind of group them up and then use this afterwards. This is also particularly useful for Hexblade Warlocks, for example, or spellcasters with Blink active. There's a lot of crazy cool things you can do with this. That being said, the sky's kind of the limit in terms of creativity, and 1 minute in terms of combat is like an eternity. That's 10 rounds. Most combats last like 5 or 6. So this'll likely last for a combat if push comes to shove. And depending on how liberally your party takes short rests, you might be able to just use this all over the place. Like, want a better deal on some goods? Wham! Phase step in the area and have them make a wisdom saving throw. You want to get out of trouble with the local guard? Wham! Phase step, have them make a wisdom saving throw. Once again, it's not a magical spell, and it doesn't say that they're aware that you did it to them, so it's pretty safe to assume you can do it subtly. There's no real components. However, you do just kind of teleport out of nowhere, and then they're enamored by you. So, however you want to roleplay that off where it makes sense, go crazy. Let me know down beneath if you have any ideas on how to do that. Now let's move on to my personal thoughts here. I'm honestly a huge fan of pretty much all of the Alladren, now that I'm actually thinking about it. The Autumn, however, is one of the more commonly used that I've seen in my games, and with good reason. Their phase step is arguably one of the best in terms of just general usefulness. Once again, it applies to social circumstances, even just getting better deals on stuff. The charm condition is just really, really strong in 5e, and early on, a lot of creatures and enemies in general you're going to be going up against, they don't really have the highest wisdom score, so it's pretty safe to assume they're going to fail it. That being said, they might just roll really good, but for the most part, yeah. And because it scales with your proficiency bonus and your charisma modifier, if you're like a warlock per se, you're gonna have a really high DC on this. And especially if you're a warlock and you're kind of squishier at the beginning, this could just save your neck constantly. So do bear that in mind. However, is it perfect? No, probably not. Is it the best and most optimized subrace for the elf? No, not really, but there's like 13 of them, so it'd be it's really hard to rank them all when you get that many. Is it a strong choice though? Yes, it really is. Also, there aren't a lot of dungeon masters that dislike the Alladren at all. There are a couple of the elven subraces I personally have a bone to pick with, namely the marked ones, but that's kind of a pretty common opinion to have. That being said, let me know what you think of the Autumn Alladren down beneath in the comments section. Be sure to mention any thoughts, questions, comments, or concerns you have about them. And please check out the playlist. Eye icon up top or end card screen on screen now. Both of them will take you to the race playlist or the elf playlist, whichever one strikes your fancy. Always best to know what your options are. And yeah, let me know if you guys have any ideas. That being said, hope you all have a great day. And as always, happy adventuring.